Hey everyone, and welcome back to Daily Tuition. In this project, we're going to create this amazing authentication app using Next.js. Authentication is an important and sensitive feature in the application, where the user credentials such as username, email, and password are validated to confirm if users are who they say they are. Using authentication, we can verify the user identity. In this project, we are going to build this amazing user authentication with 3 different authentication methods. User can log in with their Google account, with GitHub account, or with their user credential. So let's suppose that user want to sign in with Google. You just click on this sign in with Google. Once the user click on that and log in with their Gmail account, the application will redirect him to the home page where the user can see their name and email, and he can easily sign out by clicking on this sign out button. We will also going to allow user to sign in with GitHub. If the user click on this GitHub link, user will navigate to the GitHub Login page. When the user successfully sign in with GitHub, user can see their name and email. By clicking on the sign out button, user can easily sign out from this application. At the last, we build our own custom user credential authentication to verify the user. So if the user want to specify their email and password, he can easily do that. He just have to first sign up. When you click on it, you will see the register form. Here you specify your username, email, and password. So let's suppose that if I specify the username and leave this email input as it is, then you can see you will get this red border to all these text boxes because we validated all these input text boxes. So let me just specify here random email, random password, something like this. And if the user want to see their password, he can click on this button. And now when the user click on this register button, he will redirect to the login form. And once the user redirect to the login form, he can easily sign in with their email and password. So just specify the email and the password. When I click on the login button, so now the user is authenticated with their own user credential. And now when you click on the sign out, you will redirect to the login form. You're also going to learn how you can make the restricted routes and this amazing UI design. So join this journey and follow along with me to learn something amazing. So before taking your too much time, let's get started. So I'm going to open the Visual Studio Code editor, which we are using throughout this course. And then I'm going to open the empty folder inside it. And then I'm going to open the terminal. So I'm going to click on this terminal, new terminal. You can see I'm in my project directory. Now let me create a Next.js project. To create Next.js project, you have to say npx create next app and then specify your app name. I'm going to specify here name auth app. That's upon you. You can specify any name to your application. I'm going to specify auth name and press enter. Make sure you have Node installed in your local system. So just say OK and press enter. This is going to create the auth app inside this project directory. Once the app is successfully created, you will see this successful message. And now what you have to do is you have to enter into your application. So you have to say here cd auth app and press enter. You will see you are in the application. Let me clear the screen, and to run this app, you have to say npm run dev. This is going to start the application on the localhost 3000. You can notice. If you want to follow along with me from this video, you have to just check in inside this main branch. So once you clone this project and enter into the project directory, you have to say git switch main. Using this command, you can follow along with me from this current video. Now once you have your Next.js project, let me install Tailwind CSS inside this project. Using Tailwind CSS, you can rapidly build a modern website. So just type Tailwind CSS on Google and head on to tailwindcss.com. Here you can find the documentation of Tailwind. Click on the get started, and from here you have to click on this framework. I'm using Next.js framework, so I'm going to click on this Next.js, and now you have to create your project. We done that. Then you have to enter into your project directory and execute this command npm install -d Tailwind CSS, post CSS, and auto prefixer. So you have to install all these 3 packages inside your Next.js project. So I'm going to back to my project. I'm going to open my terminal, and here I'm going to paste that npm command. This is going to install all these 3 packages inside my project as a development dependencies. Now once you have all these packages, you have to execute this command npx tailwind css init -p. Let me clear the screen, execute this command, and when you execute this command, it's going to create 2 files. It's going to create tailwind config.js and post css.config.js. You will have both these files in the root directory of your project. Now the post CSS is going to configure the Tailwind CSS and the auto prefixer, and the Tailwind config file is going to allow us to use Tailwind CSS in the Next.js project. You have to add your file location inside this content. So what you have to do is you have to open the Tailwind config.js, and inside this content, you have to paste both these statements. Now these statements tell Next.js that we are using Tailwind CSS inside pages and the components folder. I'm also going to add one more statement here. Let me copy this statement and specify that here. And instead of pages, now I'm going to specify here layout. This is because I'm using Tailwind CSS in the layout folder as well. So I specify that statement here. So inside pages, components and layout, I can use Tailwind CSS. Open the global.css file and paste all these three statements inside it. So I'm going to open the styles, and here you have the global.css. Here you have to specify all these three statements at the top, right up here. Back to the Tailwind CSS, and now you have to start the development server. So I'm going to open my terminal, clear the screen, and here I'm going to say npm run dev. When I press enter, it's going to start the localhost 3000, and when I click on this link, it's going to open my Next.js project on the localhost 3000. Now let me check the Tailwind is working or not. So let me copy this h1 heading tag and then specify that inside these pages, inside this index.js. So I'm going to get rid of this main. I'm going to get rid of all this content and specify this h1 heading tag. Save this file. As you can see, the Tailwind is working. We have the border to this h1 heading tag, and we have the font bold to this hello world. Now just out of that, I want to specify my global font family to all this text. So inside this global.css, right up here, before all this statement, I'm going to add my global styling. So I'm going to back to the Google and search for Google font. Click on this Google font website. So I'm going to head on to the fonts.google.com and search for my favorite font, which is the Poppins. I'm going to select the Poppins font and select the regular styling. So I'm going to choose this regular 400, select the style, and you have to import this style in your project. So click on this import statement and copy this import link. Once you copy it, you can specify that inside your global.css file. And just after that, instead of this body, I'm going to specify this Poppins font family to all my elements. To specify that, I'm going to first select all the elements and select all the descendant elements. And then I'm going to specify this Poppins font family. So let me copy this and then specify that right here. When I save the changes back to my project, you can see I'm going to have the Poppins font family to this text. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close both these files. Inside this index.js right here, get rid of this footer because we are not using it, and get rid of these meta elements. And instead of this create next app, here I'm going to specify homepage, or you can say home. That's upon you. You can see the title is homepage. Now once we have the homepage, let's create the login and register route. So back to our project, and inside these pages, here I'm going to create a new file and name this file login.js. This is going to create an endpoint called login, and I'm going to have all the content of this login page on the login endpoint. Then I'm going to create a new route here and name this route register.js. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this route. Now inside this login.js, we need to export the default function. So we say here export default function, which is going to be login. And this is going to return a very simple division tag with h1 heading tag with login title. Save this, copy this function and specify that inside this register right here. And instead of this login, now we specify register and we change this login to register. Save this, back to the project, and here if you navigate to login, you will get your login page, you can see. And if you navigate to register, you will get your register page. Now just out of that, I have to specify head to both these sections. So at the top, I'm going to say import head from next head, and I'm going to copy this head and then specify that inside this div, something like this. Now this is going to allow me to add a title to this page. I'm going to specify here title register, and I'm going to copy this head and then specify that inside this login page. Instead of register, now I'm going to specify here login because this is the login page. And then I'm going to import this head at the top, right up here. Save this file, and if you're back to the project, you can see you have this title register, and when you're back to the login page, you will have this login title. In the finished website, we have the same panel for login and register. So instead of creating the same panel in both these components, I'm going to create a layout component and use the component. So let me show you how you can use layout component in this project. Now let's make the layout component and create a panel for register and this login component. Let me close this register file and let's create the layout component. Right inside my project, right here in the root directory, I'm going to create a new folder with the name layout. And inside this layout folder, I'm going to create a new file with the name layout.js. Now that's upon you, you can specify any name to this file. Inside this file, I'm going to create a default export function. So I'm going to say here export default function. The function name is layout. And I'm going to return a simple division tag with h1 heading tag layout. Save this file. And if you're back to the Tailwind config.js, then you can notice we specify here layout folder, so we can use Tailwind CSS styling inside this folder. Make sure you specify the same name to this folder. If you have different name to this folder, then change this statement. Now once you've done that, back to the login.js, and right up here, I'm going to import this layout. So I'm going to say here import layout from the layout file. And I'm going to grab this layout and then replace this with this div. I'm going to put this layout as a wrapper to this login. Let me save the changes and show you the result. When I open the login route, I'm going to have layout as a response. This is because we have this h1 heading tag inside this layout. But what I also want to print this children's as well. So to this layout, we specify an object and call here children, the property. And just out of this layout, now I can specify here children, something like this. Back to the project, and you can see now I'm going to have layout as well as the layout children's. Now just out of that, instead of this h1, here I'm going to create a div and specify some Tailwind classes here. So specify here class names. First, I'm going to specify flex. H is going to be screen. So the flex is going to specify display flex to this division tag, and h screen is going to specify height 100 vertical height to this div. Just out of that, I'm going to use here bg blue 400. This statement is going to specify background color to this division tag. Now these all are the Tailwind classes. You don't have to create any CSS if you are using Tailwind. You have to just stick with your HTML. Just out of that, here I'm going to create another div, and then to this div we specify some classes. First, I'm going to specify here mAuto. This is going to specify margin auto to this division tag. You can see. Just out of that, here I'm going to say bg sled 50. This will specify background color to this div. Then I'm going to specify rounded md. This will specify border radius to this division tag. And then I'm going to specify width 3 by 5. This is going to specify width 60% to this div. After that, I'm going to specify height, which is going to be 3 by 4. So this will specify height 75% to this panel. And then I'm going to specify here grade and lg grade calls to. So this is going to initialize this div as grid layout, and this class is going to say if the minimum width of the viewport is greater than 1024 pixel, then specify 2 column layout to this division tag. Otherwise, add only 1 column. Just out of that, inside this div right here, I'm going to add 2 division tags. This is going to be the first div and this is the second div. Inside the first div, I'm going to have my images, and inside the second div right here, I'm going to have my title. So let me first add title here. So let me first add here class names. So I'm going to say here write flex call. Now the flex call is going to specify flex direction column to this flex box. Then I'm going to specify here justify evenly. Now this statement is going to specify justify content space evenly to all the content of this div. And just out of that, inside this div, I'm going to add another div and add my children's here. So I'm going to grab this children's right from here and then specify that inside this div. And to this div, we specify some Tailwind classes. So I'm going to specify here text center and padding by 10. So this statement is going to specify top and bottom padding to this division tag. So it's going to specify 2.5 rem, means 40 pixel to this division tag. And now when I save the changes and when I back to the project, I'm going to have the result something like this. Here I'm going to have 2 columns. The first column is for images and the second column is for the login and for the register component. So let's suppose if I specify here background color bg gray 500, save this file, then you can notice we have here 2 columns. First for the images and second for the login component. We are also going to use the same panel for the register component. So right inside this first column, I'm going to add an image and add some live effect to it. So the image looks like the live image. So I'm going to back to my files and I'm going to copy all these images, create a new folder inside this public folder right here. I'm going to create a new folder, name this folder assets, and inside this assets, I'm going to put all these images, something like this. Don't worry, you can download all these images from this 02 layout component branch. What you have to do is you have to clone this project, then enter into the project directory using cd auth app, and then execute a command called git switch 02 and press tab. This is going to automatically add the layout component and press enter. When you press enter, you are in the layout component branch. And then you can download all these images from this public folder right from here. Now, once we understand how you can create the layout component, let's take a look at how you can create this panel. Right inside this left panel, I'm going to add an image and I'm going to add two moving clouds. To this div, I'm going to specify some CSS classes. Instead of using Tailwind CSS inside this division tag, I'm going to create a new .css file and add all my custom CSS as well as the Tailwind classes. So inside my Explorer tab right here, inside the styles folder, I'm going to create a new file. Name this file layout.module.css. Now this layout.module.css file is only going to work with this layout component. So I'm going to import this layout at the top. Right here, I'm going to say import styles from, in the single quote, I'm going to say // then specify the styles folder, and then I'm going to specify the layout module.css file. And then I'm going to specify all the styling inside this styling file. Let me close this login, and inside this layout.module, I'm going to specify styling to this division tag. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify style for this division tag. So inside this layout module.css right here, I'm going to say .img style, and here I'm going to first add the Tailwind CSS classes. Now in the CSS file, you can also use the Tailwind CSS classes. Instead of adding properties and values of CSS, you can add a Tailwind CSS classes here using apply directives. So you have to add here apply, and then you can specify your Tailwind classes here. I'm using bg gradient to r. Then I'm going to say here from blue 500. This will specify color from the left to the right side. So I'm going to say here from blue 500 to indigo 500. And then I'm going to specify here rounded L MD. Now this class is going to specify border left radius and border bottom left radius. Now just out of that, I'm going to say here position, which is relative. And then I'm going to say overflow hidden. Save this file. It's not going to do anything. This is because we don't have this style applied to this division tag. To apply this, you have to call here class names. You can specify here curly braces and say styles dot the class name. The class name is img style. So I'm going to specify that here. When I save the changes, you can see I'm going to have this gradient background color to this image. Just out of that, inside this div, instead of these images, here I'm going to create another div for the cartoon image. So I'm going to say here class names, and then I'm going to specify here class. So let me first create class, and then I'm going to specify that to this division tag. So inside this layout.css, right down here, I'm going to say dot cartoon img, and then I'm going to say background is going to be URL, and inside this URL, I'm going to say assets /img2.png. Now we already have this file inside the public folder. You can notice inside this asset folder, I'm going to have this img2.png file, and then I don't want to repeat this file, so I'm going to say no repeat. Just out of that, let me save this file, copy this cartoon img class back to the layout, and to this div we specify class name, and in the object we specify styles dot cartoon img, the property, or you can say the class name. Save this file. You're not going to get anything. This is because we need to specify some properties here. So we first specify position. Position is going to be absolute. Then we specify bottom 0, left 0, right is also going to be 0, and top is going to be 0. Just out of that, I'm going to specify width to it. Width is going to be 100%, and height is also going to be 100%. Just out of that, we need to specify background size, which is going to be cover. Save this file. You can see you're going to have this image here. Just out of that, you need to specify position to it. So I'm going to say here background position, which is going to be 65% and 100 pixel. Save this. So this will just move this image to the left side, and I'm going to have the image position what I want. Just out of that, right down here, we need to specify Z index as well. Z index is going to be 1. Just out of that, right down here, we need to add clouds as well. So we need to create 2 different division tags. So let me create that inside this layout. Here I'm going to say div and create another div. To the first div, we specify class names, and we create here 2 classes. First, I'm going to say cloud1, and then I'm going to create cloud2. And then I'm going to specify both these classes to this division tag. Right down here, I'm going to say styles dot cloud1, and then specify here class names styles dot cloud2, something like this. Save this file. Back to the layout module.css. Inside this cloud1, I'm going to specify first background. Background is going to be the URL. I'm going to access the image of the cloud. So in the single quote, I'm going to specify / assets, the folder name, and then specify cloud_1.png, and then specify no repeat because I don't want to repeat this image. Then specify position, which is going to be absolute. Then specify top is going to be 65%, and left is going to be 10%. After that, I'm going to specify width to it. Width is going to be 180 pixel. Then height is going to be 100 pixel. After that, I'm going to specify background size, which is going to be content. Save these changes. You can see I'm going to have this cloud here, and then I'm going to specify here Z index. Z index is going to be 2. Save this. We have this cloud on the front of this rock. Just out of that, I want to move this second cloud behind this rock. So to this second cloud, we specify Z index 0. So let's specify styling to this cloud too. Here I'm going to specify background. In the URL, in the single quote, we first specify the assets folder, then specify cloud2.png, and then I'm going to specify here no repeat. After that, position is going to be absolute, and top is going to be 49%. Left is going to be 50%, and width is going to be 200 pixel. Then I'm going to specify height, which is 100 pixel, and background size is going to be content. When I save the changes, you can see I'm going to have this cloud behind this rock. So for the safety, we specify here Z index, which is going to be 0. If you want to move this cloud to the front, you specify here Z index 3. That will move this cloud to the front of this rock. I'm not going to do that. I want to specify this cloud behind this rock. So I'm going to specify here Z index 0. Just out of that, I want to specify animation to both these clouds. I want to move these clouds from right to left. So to add animation to these clouds, right down here, I'm going to add CSS keyframes. Using CSS keyframes, we can specify different animation to the HTML element. So here I'm going to add @keyframes, and then I'm going to specify here animation name, which is cloud1. Now that's upon you. You can specify any name to this animation. Just out of that, inside this curly braces, we specify the stages. So for the 0%, I'm going to specify here transform translate x is going to be to 90%. And then I'm going to specify 100% for the second stage. So for the 100%, here I'm going to specify transform translate x, and instead of 290, right now I'm going to say here minus 250. Now I'm going to specify this animation to the cloud1. Let me copy this animation, move to the cloud1 class, and here I'm going to say animation. Then we specify first the animation name, which is cloud1. Then I'm going to specify the duration, which is 25.5 second is in the easing function, 5.9, and the animation need to be infinite. When I save the changes, you can see I'm going to have this moving cloud inside my application. Now let's do the same thing for the second cloud. So right down here, I'm going to copy this keyframe and then specify that here. And instead of 290, right now I'm going to specify here 160. And I'm going to leave this 100% as it is. And instead of this cloud1, we now specify cloud2. Copy this And here I'm going to add animation. Then we specify the animation name, which is cloud2. Duration is going to be 18.5 seconds. Is in the easing function. 0.9 is the delay, and infinite. Save these changes, and now you can see the second cloud is also moving. So we have this beautiful animation to this image. Now at the end, what I want, when I reload the browser, I want to specify this cloud position behind this panel. So I'm going to add here translate X property to both these clouds. Right here, I'm going to say transform translate X. For the first cloud, we specify to 90%. Copy this, and for the second cloud, we specify to 90%. Save this, and now you can see we don't have these clouds, but after a few seconds, I'm going to have both these clouds inside this panel. Now, just for now, I'm going to stop these animations. I'm going to comment this statement to stop this animation like this, and then I'm going to move to the next panel where we're going to create this login form. Now, once you understand how to create this layout component, let's take a look at how you can create this beautiful login page. So you have to open the login.js file, and here instead of this login, so get rid of this h1, and here I'm going to create a new section, and to this section we specify some classes. So I'm going to specify here Tailwind classes. So specify here class name width 3 by 4. So this will specify width, which is going to be 75% to this section, and then I'm going to add here MX auto. The MX auto is going to center all the content. After that, we specify flex and flex column. So this is going to create a column layout inside this login form. And just after that, I'm going to add some gap to the flex items. So we specify here gap 10. Just after that, inside this section, I'm going to add 3 columns. First for the title, second for the middle section where we're going to add the form, and third for the bottom section. So let's first add the title. Inside this title, I'm going to add h1 heading tag, and then I'm going to specify here text explore. Just after that, I'm going to specify some Tailwind classes here. So class names is going to be text gray 800. Then I'm going to specify here text 4XL to increase the size of this text. Then I'm going to specify here font bold to add font width, and then I'm going to add padding by 4. So this will add top and bottom padding. Just after that, just out of this h1 heading tag, I'm going to add a paragraph and add some lorem text here. So I'm going to copy and paste some demo words here, something like this. Just out of that, to this paragraph, I'm going to specify some classes. So to this paragraph, I'm going to first specify width is going to be 3 by 4. So this will add a 75% width. Then I'm going to add margin X auto. Text is going to be gray 400. So this is going to add a paragraph inside this project. Now what I want to remove this background gray color. So I'm going to back to the layout, and as you know, we have this background gray color to this division tag. So I'm going to remove this class right from here. Save this. So you will have the white background to this section. Just out of that, back to the login.js. Let's create a new form. Just out of this comment, here I'm going to say form, get rid of this action attribute because we are not using it, and then specify some Tailwind classes here. So classes is going to be flex call, and gap is going to be 5. So inside this form right down here, I'm going to add my different input groups. So let's create a division tag with the class input groups, or you can say input group. And inside this div, I'm going to add my input tag of the type email. Now this text box is for the email. So we specify here type email. Then I'm going to specify here name, which is going to be email. And then I'm going to specify here placeholder, which is going to be email. Let me save this. You can see I'm going to have this text box here. Now just out of that, I'm going to copy this div and specify that right down here to create another div. So this is going to create another input group with the input type email. But instead of email, right now I'm going to change this to password. Copy this, specify that to this email and to this placeholder. So this is the second text box of this login form. Just out of that, just out of this input text boxes, right down here, I'm going to have my login button. So just out of this div, right down here, I'm going to add a comment and say login buttons. So I'm going to add here a division tag with the class input button. And then I'm going to add here a button of the type submit. and to this button we specify login text. Save this. You can see I'm going to have this button here. We're also going to have two more authentication method for the Google and GitHub. So let's add both these buttons as well. Copy this, write down here, paste this button, and then specify here sign in with Google. Let me copy this button, paste it right down here, and instead of sign in with Google, here I'm going to say sign in with GitHub. Save this, and I'm going to have this result here. Now what I want to separate these buttons. So let me cut this right down here. I'm going to create another div with input button and paste my buttons here. Copy the last button and place that inside the input button class right here. Save the changes. As you can see, I'm going to have the result what I want. Now just after that, just after this form, right down here, I'm going to have a link so the user can easily move to the register page. So right down here, I'm going to add a paragraph, and then I'm going to specify here some Tailwind classes. So I'm going to add some classes here. Classes is going to be text center, text gray, 400, and right inside this paragraph, I'm going to say don't have an account yet. Then click on this link component. I'm going to add here a link component. Make sure you import this link component at the top. So at the top right up here, you need to say import link from next link. And then I'm going to add here inside this link, here I'm going to specify href attribute, href, and then inside these curly braces, here I'm going to add / register, the route path of the register page. And inside this link, here I'm going to add my anchor tag. And inside this anchor tag, here I'm going to say sign up. And then to this anchor tag, we specify some Tailwind classes. So I'm going to say here class name, text blue 700. When I save the changes, you can see I'm going to have this bottom text. And now when you click on this sign up, you will now navigate to this register page. Now, once we have the login form, let's take a look at how we can style it. So instead of adding all the Tailwind classes inside this login.js, I'm going to create a new CSS file inside this style sheet. So inside this styles folder, I'm going to create a new file. Name this file form.module.css. So we are going to create a modular file of CSS, and inside this, I'm going to style all these form elements. So let me first style this input group. So inside this form module.css, here I'm going to say dot input group, and then I'm going to specify Tailwind classes here. So as I said, to apply Tailwind classes, you need to add apply directives and then specify your Tailwind classes here. So I'm using flex, border, and rounded XL. So this is going to specify border radius to this input group. Just after that, I'm going to add here position, which is going to be relative. Save this file back to the login.js, and at the top, right up here, I'm going to say import styles from // then specify the styles folder, and then I'm going to specify the form module.css, and I'm going to use this class inside my login.js. So right here, instead of this input group, I'm going to get rid of this, pass here curly braces, and say here styles dot the class name, which is input group. So now we have this styling to this division tag. When I save the changes, you can see I'm going to have the styling to this division tag. Just after that, I'm going to specify styling to this input text box. So right down here, I'm going to say dot input text, and then I'm going to apply some Tailwind classes here. So add here apply directives, and then specify width, which is going to be full, which is 100%. Then add padding by 4. This will add top and bottom padding. Then add padding x6. This will add a left and right padding. Add border and rounded XL. So this will add border radius to this input text box. After that, I'm going to specify bg sled 50. Just after that, on the next line, I'm going to add another apply directives, and then add here focus outline none. Now that's upon you. You can add this class after this bg class as well. I wanted to put this on a single line so we can read this code more easily. So I put another apply directives and then specify here focus outline none, and border is going to be none. Save this file, copy this class back to the login.js, and to this input text box right here, we specify class names. In the curly braces, we specify styles dot input text. You can see I'm going to have this input text box here, what I want. Just after that, I'm going to copy this class and then specify that to the password right here to the second input text box. Save this and I'm going to have this password field. You can see. Just after that, I also want to specify this input group. So I'm going to copy this and instead of this class name, I'm going to replace this with the input group classes. Save this. You can see I'm going to have this password. Just after that, I'm going to style these buttons. So inside this form module.css, right down here, I'm going to first select the button and then I'm going to add here apply directives. And right down here, I'm going to say width is going to be full, bg gradient to right from blue 500 and to indigo 500. After that, I'm going to specify rounded MD. Just after that, right down here, I'm going to add another apply directives and then I'm going to say here padding by 3, text gray 50 and text LG. Save this, copy this class back to the buttons right down here and I'm going to add here class names. So let me add here class name in the curly braces, specify styles dot button. Save this. You can see I'm going to have this button here. Just after that, let me create hover effect on this button. So right down here, I'm going to say dot button hover, and when we hover on this button, I want to specify some classes. So add here apply directives again and then add bg gradient to right from gray 50 and to gray 100. After that, I'm going to specify here border which is going to be blue 500. Just after that, I'm going to add apply directive again and then specify here text gray 700. And just after that, I also want to specify border to this login when we hover on it. So right down here, I'm going to say border. Save this. You can see I'm going to have this hover effect on this login button. Now let me specify styling to this sign up with Google and sign up with GitHub. So let me specify styling to both these buttons. So right down here, just after this button, I'm going to add here button custom and then I'm going to add some Tailwind classes. So add here apply, width is going to be full, border, padding by 3, then I'm going to specify flex, justify center, gap is going to be 2 and hover, I'm going to create hover effect. So I'm going to add here hover, bg gray 200. I'm going to add these classes to both these buttons. So I'm going to back to the login and right down here, I'm going to specify classes. In the curly braces, I'm going to specify styles dot button custom. Copy this class name and then specify that to the second button. Save this. You can see I'm going to have these buttons here. Now what I want, instead of having 3 submit button inside a single form, I'm going to change this button type to button. So I'm only going to have only one submit button inside my form, which is this one, this login button. I only want single submit button inside my form. So I'm going to change this type to button. Just after that, let me add image inside both these buttons. To add an image, as you know, we already have here images inside my public folder, inside my assets. You can see I'm going to have few images here, github.svg and google.svg. I'm using both these images inside this login.js file. So just after this sign in with Google, I'm going to add Next.js image component. Let me import this component at the top. So right up here, I'm going to say import image from Next.js image. And inside this image, you need to specify the source attribute. So inside the source, as you know, we have these images on the assets folder. So we specify assets, then specify the file name, which is google.svg. Don't forget to specify width and height, otherwise you will get an error message. So we specify here width, which is going to be 20 pixel, and height is going to be 20. You don't have to worry about these curly braces. Both values will return 20 pixel to these properties. Now let me save these changes and show you the result first. You can see I'm going to have this Google icon. Just after that, let me add here GitHub icon. So I'm going to add here image. In the src, I'm going to say single quote dot / assets and then specify github.svg, the file name. After that, don't forget to specify width, and now I'm going to specify width 25 pixel and height is going to be 25 pixel. Save this. You can see I'm going to have this GitHub icon here. Now let's add icons inside these input text boxes. So to add that, I'm going to search for React icons and click on this first reacticons.github.io website. And right from here, you can install the React icons inside your project. So let me first install this, copy this command, back to the project, open the terminal, and here I'm going to execute a command, npm install react icons --c. This is going to install these React icons inside my project. Once I have it, let me start the development server again, npm run dev. This will start the development server. Let me close this, and I'm going to back to the top right here. And as you can see, to import this icon, you have to just say import and the icon path. In this documentation, the icon is used from the font awesome icon. Here you have different options, so you can use different icons inside this project. I'm using hero icons. So let's search for the hero icons. Here it is. Let me click on it. And from these icons, I'm using @ icon and the fingerprint icon, this one. I'm going to copy this import statement and then specify that right here. And instead of this icon name, now I'm going to copy this icon name. So just click on it. This will copy this icon name, specify that right here. As well as I'm using this fingerprint icon, this one. Click on it and specify here comma and then specify the icon name. So we have here two icons. So let me use these icons inside my input text box. So right down here to this first input text box, right here, I'm going to add a span tag. Inside this span tag, I'm going to add this @ symbol. So copy this component and specify that right here. Or you can just self-close this component. That's upon you. Just add that to this span tag, we specify some Tailwind classes. So I'm going to specify class names, icon. This is my custom class. Then I'm going to add Tailwind class flex, items, center, and padding x 4. These all are the Tailwind classes. Just out of that, let me save the changes. You can see I'm going to have this icon here. Let me increase the size of it. So you can access the property of this icon, which is size. And I'm going to specify size 25 pixel. Save this. You can see this will increase the size of this icon. And just out of that, I'm going to copy this span tag, specify that to the second input text box right down here. And instead of this icon, I'm going to grab this second icon and then specify that right here. Save this. You can see I'm going to have this fingerprint icon here. Just for that, let me add some styling to it. So inside this form module.css, inside this file, let me add some style to it. So I'm going to first specify the color to these icons. So let me copy this input text because inside that we have these icons. So I'm going to say here input text. Then I'm going to specify here plus and select all the descendant elements, something like this. And then I'm going to specify here color, which is going to be the hex color. So I'm going to specify here hex color, something like this. This will change the icon color, you can see. Now just out of that, what I want when I focus on this input text box, I want to change the color of this icon. So to do that, let me just add here input text and add here pseudo selector, which is focus. So when we focus on the input text box, I'm going to select all the descendant elements. So I'm going to add here plus asterisk like this and then change color of it. So copy this color property, specify that here. And instead of this gray color, I'm going to specify the indigo color here in the hex value. Save this. And now when I click on this input text box, you can see I'm going to have this color to this icon. Just out of that, what I want to see my password. By clicking on this icon, I want to see and hide my password. So what we are going to do is I'm going to create on-click event on this fingerprint icon. So I'm going to back to the login. At the top, I need to first create React state. So right here, I'm going to say constant. In the array, we need to say show set show. And I'm going to specify equal to sign and say use state. Now we don't have this use state function, so we need to import this. Right down here, I'm going to say import. In the curly braces, I'm going to say use state from React. Just add that to this use state, we specify false value, the default value of this password field. Just add that what I want when I click on this icon, I want to invert this show value. So to do that, right down here, as you can see, we have this button here. So instead of creating on click event to this icon, I'm going to create that on this span tag. Here I'm going to say on click, and here I'm going to call the arrow function and say set show, and then I'm going to specify here show. And as I said, I want to invert the value. So I'm going to pass here exclamation mark, something like this. Let me save this. And at the end, what we need to do is instead of this type password, here I'm going to add curly braces and add template string. And then I'm going to add here dollar, curly braces, and say here show, and call here if we have true inside the show, then print text, otherwise print password. Save this, back to the project. And now if I type something here, and when I click on this span tag, this will just change the password to text. At the end, let me just specify here cursor to this icon. So inside this form module.css, right down here, I'm going to select input text, and then I'm going to say here not type is equal to email. If the input text box is not a type of email, then call here tilde operator and then select the span tag. And on the span tag, I'm going to create hover effect. And then I'm going to select all the descendant elements of this span tag, something like this. And here I'm going to specify this color, and cursor is going to be pointer. Let me save these changes. Now, if I hover on this button, you can see I'm going to have this cursor, and this will change the color of this icon. So now you can see using this button, I can change the type of this input text box. Now, once we understand how we can make the login page, let's take a look at how to create the register page. When you click on this sign up link, it's going to redirect us to the register page. Now let's create this register page. So I'm going to just back to my project, and you can see I'm going to have here register.js file, open it, and instead of this div, we need to wrap this in the layout component. So I'm going to say here import layout from, in the single quote, I'm going to say /layout.js, and then I'm going to copy this component and replace this with this division tag. When I save the changes, I'm going to have the default layout styling to this register page. Just out of that, my register and the login page are identical. So instead of adding all the code of this login again, let me copy this section, something like this, and then specify that inside this register. So instead of this h1 heading tag, I'm going to paste the section tag, something like this. Now at the end, you have to import these statements. So I'm going to copy this and specify that right up here. Right now I don't have this show, so let me just specify here true for now. Save the changes, and you can see I'm going to have the same login page as a response. But what I want, instead of this login, I want the register page. So let me just change few things of this register page. So at the top, instead of this h1 heading tag here, I'm going to say register. Save this. Just out of that, right down here inside this form, instead of this email, here I'm going to specify here type text. This is for username, so I'm going to pass here username, and the placeholder is going to be username. Or you can just copy this division tag and paste that right up here, and then you can change this type to text. This email became username, and this placeholder became username, and you can replace this type to email. Save this. So you'll have another input text box here. Just out of that, at the bottom, right after this input text box, right down here, I'm going to copy this div and paste that right down here. And instead of password, I'm going to change this to C password, means confirm password. So right here, instead of this placeholder, I'm going to say confirm password. And then I'm going to change this name to C password. Let me save this. Here I'm going to have another text box, you can notice. And now I'm going to get rid of both these buttons. I'm not using this Google and this GitHub button inside this register page. So I'm going to get rid of that right from here. Save this. So I'm going to have this login button. You can see what I want to change these icons now. So instead of this add the data icon here to the first input text box, I'm going to change this to outline user. And let me import that right up here, something like this. So I'm going to have this user, you can see. Now just out of that, let me just add visibility to this password. So as you know, right down here, I only have true inside this statement. Instead of this, I'm going to create a new state here. So at the top, I'm going to say constant show and set show is equal to use state. We already imported this use state at the top, you can notice. And inside this use state, this time, instead of just this true value, I'm going to specify here an object. This is because right now we have two input text boxes. So inside this object, I'm going to create a property called password and specify default value false. And for the confirm password, I'm going to say C password is going to be false. And then instead of this true, I'm going to say here show dot password, and right down here instead of true, I'm going to say here show dot C password. This text box is for confirm password, so we pass here C password. After that, we also have on click event, which will invert the value of this show variable. So instead of just show, we specify here show dot C password, and at the top we specify show dot password. And if I want to see my password, I can click on this button, but that will not work. This is because this statement is going to change the initial value of the state. So what we have to do is we need to get the initial state first and then change the initial value. So instead of this statement, I'm going to get rid of it and pass here an object. And inside this object, we first get the initial value. So I'm going to say here show, and we need to use a spread operator like this, and then combine the password field. So pass here comma and say here password, and the value is going to be show dot password. But I'm going to invert this value, so I'm going to pass here exclamation mark. And let me do the same for this confirm password. I'm going to paste this statement here, and instead of password, I'm going to say here C password, and this became C password. So I'm changing the value of the C password variable. Let me save this. Now if I click on this button, you can see I can see my password. I can toggle my C password and password. And just out of that, when you scroll down, here you can see we have this paragraph. Instead of don't have an account, now we can say have an account, then go to this login page. And then I'm going to change this text to sign in. Save this. So I'm going to have this text here. Now when I click on this sign in, I'm going to redirect to the login page. And now when I click on this sign up, I'm simply going to redirect to the register page. Let's take a look at how you can create the home page. So if you back to the home page, then you can notice you're only going to have this hello world. So instead of the simple hello world inside this index file, I'm going to create here two components. First for the guest, and second for the authorized user. Guest user don't have to log in inside the website. Guest user can only read the documents, so you don't have to log in inside the website. But the authorized user need to log in inside the website so you can read and edit their own profile. So let's take a look at how we can create these components. So I'm going to first create the guest component. So let's create here a function guest, and then I'm going to specify here return statement. Inside this return statement, here I'm going to simply going to copy this main and specify that right here. And instead of this styling, and here I'm going to specify container mx auto to center all the content, then specify text center to center text, and then specify here padding by 20. So this will add top and bottom padding. After that, inside this, I'm going to have here h3 heading tag, and then specify here some classes. Classes is going to be text for Excel and font bold. And then here I'm going to say guest homepage. Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to create a division tag, and inside this div, let me first specify classes. So I'm going to say here class name, flex, and justify center. Inside this div, I'm going to create a link component, and inside that I'm going to add an anchor tag, and here I'm going to say sign in. And then to this link component, I'm going to specify href attribute. Href is going to be the / login route, so the guest user can log in with this sign in link. Just out of that, here I'm going to specify some classes. So I'm going to add here margin top 5, padding x 10, so this will add a left and right padding, padding y1 to add top and bottom padding, rounded sm will add border radius, then I'm going to say here bg indigo 500. After that, I'm going to say here text gray. Save these changes, and just out of that, right up here instead of this main, I'm going to call this guest component here. Save this. Oops, I think I misspelled. Yes, the link component is not defined. Now let me define the link component. I'm going to say here import link from next link. Save this. Here you can see I'm going to have this guest homepage. Now here you can add any content for the guest user. Now just after that, let's create the authorized user. So here I'm going to create a function, name this function user, or you can specify authorized user, that's upon you. And then I'm going to say here return. Just after that, I'm going to copy this main, specify that inside this authorized user. Instead of guest homepage, here I'm going to say authorize user homepage. Just after that, instead of this login, now I'm going to say here profile. So the user can click on this button and head on to his profile section. So I'm going to say here profile page. Just after that, inside this right here, I'm going to add a division tag and display the details of the user. So let me specify here class name details. Now here I'm going to add h5 and then specify the authorized username. Right now I don't know the user, so instead of the username I'm going to say here unknown, and I'm also going to print the user email. So let me copy this h5 and specify that here, and then I'm going to specify unknown here because right now I don't have the authorized user. Just after that, we also need to allow user to sign out. If the user is successfully signed in, we need to allow user to sign out. So we need to create here a button. So right down here, I'm going to create a div with the class flex and then specify here justify center to center all the content. Then I'm going to create here a button and then specify here text sign out. And inside this button, we specify some classes. So we specify here class names, margin top 5, padding x10, padding y1, rounded sm, bg, indigo 500 and bg gray 50. Let me save the changes, and now instead of this guest, let me print this user. Save the changes. You can see I'm gonna have this authorized user homepage. Now just out of that, what I want to identify the guest and the authorized user. So for that, I'm going to create here a new state. So at the top, I'm going to say constant session and set session is equal to use state. And now the default value of use state is false. Just for that, here I'm going to say if we have the session true, then call the user component. Otherwise, call the guest component. And at the top, don't forget to import use state from the React library. Let me say this. The default value of use state is false. This is because we get the guest homepage. When I change this value to true, you can see I'm going to have the authorized user homepage. Now later in this course, instead of this use state session variable, I'm going to call the NextAuth session and then specify that to this variable. So using NextAuth, we get the access token of the user and identify the authorized or the guest user. Now, once we have the index page, let's take a look at how you can authorize the user. What I'm going to do is I'm going to back to the Google and search for NextAuth.js. And using this NextAuth.js.org website, I'm going to install this package in my Next.js application. NextAuth.js is the authentication for Next.js. This library is used to authenticate the user. NextAuth has built-in support for popular services like Google, Facebook, Auth, and many more. NextAuth is completely flexible and can be used with database like MySQL, MongoDB, and Postgres. To add NextAuth in your application, you have to create NextAuth.js file in the server, and on the client side, you wrap the session provider and pass the session. The session variable is just going to create a cookies and store all your values inside your client application. And your component is just going to say if you have your session, then that is your authorized user. Otherwise, you have the guest user. So this is a very simple concept of NextAuth. So what we have to do is we need to first create this NextAuth.js file. So before we create this file, we need to install NextAuth. So we need to first install NextAuth in the Next.js application. To do that, you can click on this npm and open a new tab. You have to execute a command npm I for install and then specify NextAuth. Let me copy this. Let me first stop the development server, clear the screen, and here I'm going to say npm I for install NextAuth. When I press enter, this is going to install the NextAuth library inside my Next.js project. Now once we have this library, what you have to do is you have to create this NextAuth.js file. Right inside this API folder, I'm going to create another folder and name this auth. And inside this folder, I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to name this file NextAuth.js. But what I'm going to do is Instead of just NextAuth, I'm going to wrap the NextAuth file name inside a bracket. And here I'm going to say triple dot NextAuth, and then I'm going to specify here .js. You can see how I specify name to this file. Using these triple dots inside this bracket, we can catch all the routes. So any route redirect to this path will be catched by this endpoint. From this file, you have to return the NextAuth function. So if you back to the documentation, then you can notice here you can find we export the default function called NextAuth, and we get this function from the NextAuth library. In the application, I'm going to say import NextAuth from, in the single quote, I'm going to say NextAuth. Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to say export default NextAuth. And then to this NextAuth, we specify different options right inside these curly braces. And now if you closely take a look at this documentation, then you can notice here we have a different import statement. And all this import statement is going to import the provider. Authentication provider in Next.js are services that can be used to sign in a user. So you can notice here we have here an Apple provider, Facebook provider, Google provider, and the email provider. Using any of these services, you can log in inside your application. You can find more about these providers when you click on this documentation. So when you click on it, here you can find you have these providers. And here you have all your providers of this Next.js authentication. So as you know, we are using Google and GitHub. So you can search for here Google. So here it is. We have this GitHub and Google. If you click on it, you can see the documentation of Google Login. So what you have to do is, you have to first create application inside Google and then specify your client ID and your client secret to this Google provider. So the Google provider can authorize the user. So to get your client ID and client secret, you have to create a new Google application inside the Google console. So just click on this link, console.developers.google.com. So this is going to open the page something like this. Here you can create a new project and specify your credential. So what you have to do is, you have to first log in on this Google Cloud and click on this Auth consent screen. What you have to do is, you have to specify your application details. I already have my application detail here. Let me show that. So the application name is Auth app. Then we have the publishing status, which is testing. The user type is external. Then when I scroll down here, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to leave everything as it is. If I click on this edit app, you have to first specify your app name, the user support email. If you have your app logo, then you can specify that here. Leave everything as it is and just specify your contact information right down here. So specify your email here. After that, click on save and continue. Just out of that, leave everything as it is here. Click on save and continue again. Leave everything as it is here as well and click on save and continue. At the end, you will have the summary like this. Just click on back to dashboard. Just out of that, click on credential. And here you have to create new credentials for this application. So just click on this create credential and click on this auth client ID. So you have to request for the auth client ID and then specify your application type. My application type is for web application. So I'm going to choose this web application and then I'm going to specify name for my app, which is auth app. Then I have to specify the origin. You have to specify the authorized JavaScript origins. So just click on this add URL and paste my link here. Something like this. Right down here to this authorized redirect URLs, here you specify for use with request from a web server. So if you click on the sign in button where you want to redirect the user. So we add here a URL something like this. I'm going to first specify my domain and then I'm going to specify the API folder. Then I'm going to specify the auth folder. Then I'm going to say callback and Google. So when the user click on sign in, I'm going to redirect the user to this path. The NextAuth library will automatically handle this path and return the authorized user as a response. So you have to specify this path and click on this create button. When you click on it, this is going to create a new auth client. You can see your client ID and your client secret. So what you have to do is you have to copy your client ID and client secret in your application. Or you can download this by clicking on this download JSON. Back to my project, and here I'm going to create two variables. Constant client ID is equal to, here I'm going to specify my client ID and I'm going to say constant client secret. And then I'm going to copy this client secret and then specify that here. And I'm going to click on this OK button. So next what I have to do is I have to call this Google provider and pass client ID and client secret as a parameter. Now you don't let anyone to access your client ID and client secret. So instead of storing both these values inside this JS file, let me create the .env file inside my project. So I can store both these values inside it. So I'm going to create here a new file inside my project and name this file .env.local. And inside this file, I'm going to create both these variables. So let me copy this first variable and then specify that right here. And I'm going to just capitalize this client ID variable. So I'm going to say here client ID. And this is the Google ID. So I'm going to say here Google client ID. Or you can just say here Google ID. Just out of that, you don't have to specify here double quote because in .env, everything is in the string. Just out of that, I'm going to say here Google secret is equal to, and then I'm going to copy this secret and then specify that right here. Let me save this file, close this .env.local and get rid of both these variables. And just out of that, right down here, you have to specify the Google provider because as you know, inside this app, we are using Google and GitHub provider. So at the top here, I'm going to say import Google provider from, in the double quote, you specify NextAuth / providers / and then specify here Google. So you get your Google provider from this Google package. Just out of that, right inside this NextAuth, here you specify all your providers inside this provider property. So you have to say here providers, specify colon, and inside an array, you specify different providers. So as you know, we have here Google provider. So let me copy this, create here a comment and say Google provider. And then I'm going to call this Google provider here. And inside this parenthesis, you specify your client ID and client secret as an object. So we pass here curly braces. And here I'm going to say client ID. I'm going to have this client ID inside the .env.local file. So I'm going to say here process.env. I'm going to copy this Google ID and then specify that right here. Then pass comma and then specify the client secret. So to specify client secret, you create here client secret property and then specify process.env. And then specify this Google secret here, this variable. That's it. Your authentication is successfully ready from the server. Next, what you have to do is on the client side, you have to call the session provider inside your app component and specify the session provider as a wrapper to your component. So inside the app.js, right here, you have to wrap this app component inside the session provider. So you can share the same session between all the pages. So at the top, here I'm going to say import. In the object, you specify session provider. From, in the single quote, you specify NextAuth / React. From the React library, you get the NextAuth session provider component. And just out of that, you have to grab this component and inside a parenthesis, you specify first session provider, something like this, and wrap your component inside this session provider like this. And in the documentation, you can notice we have to specify the session property to this session provider. You get this session property from the page props. So instead of destructuring this session, I'm just going to say here session to this session provider. Inside these curly braces, I'm going to say page props dot session, something like this. That's it. On the client page, you have to call use session, sign in and sign out button. And then using this data session variable, you can access your sign in user. So let me first copy this and back to my login page. And here I'm going to paste that statement. And you can see inside my section, when I scroll down, here I'm going to have my Google sign in button. So on this Google sign in button, I'm going to create the handler function. So when we click on it, I'm going to call this function sign in of this NextAuth. The sign in function is going to make a request to this NextAuth and redirect you to the Google authentication page. So what you have to do is write down here to this button, you specify on click event, on click, and here you specify the handler function, which is handle Google sign in. Now let me create this handler function at the top. So scroll up and right here you specify the handler function. So I'm going to say here Google handler function. So I'm going to create here a sync function, handle Google sign in. And when you click on it, I'm going to call this sign in function. And this function is going to redirect us to the Google authentication page. So here inside the single quote, you specify Google. And then as a second argument, right here, you specify an object and specify the callback URL where you want to redirect the user. So you specify the callback URL, and inside this double quote, I'm going to specify the localhost 3000 page. So I'm going to redirect my authorized user on my home page. So I'm going to specify that path here as a callback URL. Let me save this file back to the index.js, and here I want to access my session variable. So if you back to the documentation, then you can notice using this use session, you can access your session variable, and using this session variable, you can access your user and email. So inside this login.js, I'm going to copy this statement, get rid of this use session right from here because I'm not using it. Inside this login.js, I'm going to back to the index.js. I'm going to paste that use session. And right here, instead of this constant session, I'm going to say constant. In the object, we specify data session is equal to use session, something like this. So this use session is going to return data, and I'm going to get that inside this variable. So now once we have the session, I'm going to return the authorized user, otherwise return the guest user. Now to access the user name and email to this user, I can specify this session variable, and using this session variable, I can display the username and email. So to this user, I'm going to specify an object and specify here session variable. Now when I call this user, I'm going to pass this session right here as an object, something like this. So now I can access this user inside this user component, and instead of this unknown, right now I'm going to say here session.user.name. This is going to print the username, and instead of this h5 here, I'm going to specify session.user.email. So using this user object, you can get your username and email of the authorized user. Scroll up, save all the changes, save this file as well, back to the project and reload it. You can see now I'm going to get guest as a response. This is because now I'm not the authorized user. Now if I open my login page, so if I click on this sign in button, this will redirect me to the login page. And now when I click on this sign in with Google, this is going to redirect me to the Google authentication page. And now by clicking on my email, you can see I'm going to redirect to the home page. This is the Google account name and the email. So now you can see you successfully created Google authentication in your application. Now next, I want to protect this route and click on this sign out button. Now, once you understand how you can create the Google sign-in, if the user head on to the home page, he's going to get the guest home page as a response. But what I want to restrict this route from accessing the guest user as well. So what I want to protect this home page. I only want to access this home page when the user successfully logged in. So in that case, we need to protect this route. So let's take a look at how we can do it in the application. I'm going to back to the index.js file, and right here, as you know, when we have the session, then we return the user, otherwise return the guest user. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to restrict this home page from accessing the unauthorized user. So right down here, I'm going to create and call a function. So I'm going to say here export async function, and the function name is get server side props. Using this function, I'm going to generate this page only when we have the session in the cookies. So inside this function, here I'm going to say constant session is equal to, and then I'm going to call here await because this is the async function, and here I'm going to say get session. I'm going to get this get session from the NextAuth, right from NextAuth React. I'm going to call this get session here, and right down here inside this get server side prop, inside this parenthesis, I'm going to specify an object and pass the request object. You can get the request object from this get server side props from the context. So you can simply specify here context dot request, and you need to pass this context up here, or you can just simply pass here an object and say request, and here inside this get session you just need to specify the request. This request object is going to return the cookies, and when we have the session cookies inside this variable, I'm going to return this session, otherwise redirect the user to the login page. So right down here, I'm going to say if we have the session, then I'm going to return the user. So I'm going to say here return. In the object, I'm going to say props, and in the object, I'm going to say session. So if we have the user, I'm simply going to return the session. If the user is not authorized, then I'm going to say here if. In the condition, I'm going to say if we don't have the session variable, Then I'm going to execute this if statement. And here I'm going to return an object and call here redirect. And then inside this redirect object, you need to specify your destination. And then the destination is going to be the login page. And after that, you specify permanent false. Now this get server side props is only going to create this home page when we have the user. Otherwise, it's going to redirect us to the login page. Back to the project and reload it. You can see if I try to access the home page, I'm going to redirect to the login page automatically. You can see. Now if I try to log in by clicking on this sign in with Google, I can now easily access the home page. You can notice. Now just for that, I want to make the sign out feature to this application. So to do that, just back to the index.js, right up here inside this home, I'm going to create the handler function. So I'm going to say here function handle sign out. Then I'm going to specify here a function. I'm going to specify name to this function handle sign out, and inside this function I'm going to call this sign out function of NextAuth React. So here we need to first say sign out. We need to import this function, and then we need to call this function right here. You don't need to pass anything to this sign out. It's automatically going to remove all the values from the cookies. Let me save this. Now just for that, let me specify this handle sign out to the button. As you know, inside this user, I have here a button, this one. This is my sign out button. You can see. Now to this button, let me specify on click event. So I'm going to say here on click is going to be handle sign out. And don't forget to pass this value to this object. We are accessing this handler function from the parent. So we need to pass this inside this object. And when we call this user, we need to pass this handler function. Something like this. Back to the project, reload it. You can see I'm the authorized user. When I click on this sign out, the application is going to redirect me to the login page again. When I try to back to the home page, it's going to redirect me to the login page. And now, if I want to access the home page, I want to log in again. Now, once you understand how you can make the Google login, let's take a look at how you can create GitHub login. You have to head on to the github.com and sign in with your username and password. Just after that, once you successfully sign in, you have to open this profile section and click on this settings. When you click on the settings, scroll down and click on this developer settings. Here you have three options: GitHub apps, Auth apps, and personal access token. You have to click on this Auth app. You have to create your application here. The Auth app application is used to access the GitHub API. So to access the GitHub API login feature, you have to register your new application. So just click on this button, register a new application. Here you specify your application name. I'm going to specify here application name Auth app. Then I'm going to specify my home page. So this is the development home page. Later when you deploy your application, you can change this homepage URL. Now this application description is optional. I'm going to leave this as it is, but we need to specify the authorized callback URL here. So inside this authorized callback URL, you need to specify the path of the callback URL. You need to specify your domain, the API folder, the auth folder, and the callback endpoint. And just after that, you have to click on this register application. This is going to create a new application inside the GitHub. You can see, and you can see right down here, you have your client ID and client secret. So let me first copy the client ID back to my application, open the .env.local file, and right here, I'm going to say GitHub _ ID is equal to, I'm going to specify my GitHub ID and say here GitHub secret. And then I'm going to copy this secret. So let me just generate the new client secret. When you click on this generate new client secret, it's going to generate a new client secret. Let me copy this by clicking on this icon, and then I'm going to paste my secret here. And now once you specify that, you have to start your development server again. So just stop the development server and restart it using npm run dev. So this is going to start the development server and going to create both these variables. Just for that, close this .env file, back to the NextAuth.js, and right here you have to import the GitHub provider. So at the top, right up here, you have to say import GitHub provider. From, in the single quote, you specify NextAuth / providers, and inside that you have GitHub package. So you specify that here. And from this GitHub package, you get the GitHub provider. And then you have to specify this GitHub provider as an array to this provider property. So just out of this Google provider, I'm going to specify here comma, and say here GitHub provider. And inside this parenthesis, I'm going to specify curly braces and pass my client ID and client secret. So let me just specify here client ID. Client ID is going to be process.env.github ID. So let me specify that here, pass comma and say client secret is going to be process.env.variable, which is GitHub secret, like this. Now just after that, you have to save all the changes. Back to the login.js, and here you can see we already have the handler function for the Google login. Let's create another handler function here for GitHub login. So at the top, I'm going to say GitHub login, and then I'm going to specify here async function. We are going to create async handler function here, async function handle GitHub sign in or login. That's upon you. You can create any function here. Just out of that, inside this, you need to call sign in function of NextAuth, this one, and then specify here in the single quote GitHub. Because this sign in is for GitHub, we specify here GitHub, and then we need to specify the redirect URL as well. So I'm going to copy this object of this Google login and then specify that as a second argument. And then we need to specify this handler to the GitHub button. So when you scroll down, here you have the GitHub button, this one. Here I'm going to specify on click handle GitHub sign in. Save this file, back to the project, and if I reload it and click on this sign in with GitHub, I'm going to redirect to the GitHub authentication page. And here I need to specify my username and password. So let me specify that and click on this sign in button. You can see as a response, you are redirected to the home page and you'll get your username and email. So now you are successfully logged in using your GitHub account. Now if you want to sign out, you can just click on this sign out button and sign out from the GitHub API. So this is how you can simply make a Google and GitHub login. Let's take a look at how you can create your own custom login using NextAuth.js. Now, once you understand how you can create the Google and GitHub login, let's take a look at how you can create your own credential login inside this application. So what we are going to do is we're going to allow user to sign up with this register page, and once the user successfully register, he can sign in with their email and password. So let's take a look at how we can do it. So before we add credential inside NextAuth file, let's take a look at how we can get the values from these input text boxes. For that, in this course, I'm using a library called Formik. And using this library, I'm going to build a simple form with validation. So you have to search for Formik and click on this formik.org website and click on this get started. When you click on it, you have some documentation here. To use Formik, you have to say here npm install Formik. Let me copy this command and then open my terminal. And here I'm going to say npm install Formik -- save. So this is going to install this Formik inside this application. Now just for that, you have different options to use Formik. You can use Formik as a component, or you can use Formik as a hook. I'm using Formik as a hook. So I'm going to click on this tutorial, scroll down. Here you can see you have some basic information of Formik. To use Formik, you have to call the hook, which is use Formik inside your React application, and then you have to call that hook and specify the initial values to your input text boxes. And then when you submit your form, you can get all the values of your input text boxes inside the values variable. And then to this input text box, you have to specify on change event, as well as you have to pass value attribute. So the Formik can get values from this input text boxes. So inside my login.js right here, let me close all these files. Right here inside my login, let me add Formik. So at the top here, I'm going to say import. In the object, you specify use Formik from, in the single quote, you specify Formik. And just out of that, inside this login, I'm simply going to say constant Formik is equal to use Formik. And inside this hook, you can specify different options. So inside an object, you first specify the initial value. So you call a property initial values. Inside an object, you specify your input text boxes name. So I have email. So I'm going to say here email and pass value. And then I also have password inside my form. So I'm going to say here password and pass value to this password. Then to this Formik, you can access the onSubmit handler function. Instead of creating this onSubmit inside this Formik object, I'm going to create a async function here. So I'm going to say here async function on submit, and then specify here values. Now you're going to get all your input text boxes values inside this variable. Just for now, I'm going to say here console.log values, and you have to pass this on submit to this Formik hook right here, just out of this object. You specify here comma and say on submit. Now we don't have to worry about the property because the property name is on submit, and you're passing the same function name to this property. If you have a different name to this on submit, you can specify here colon and then specify your function name, something like this. But I have the same property name to this function, so instead of this colon, I'm going to specify this on submit here. Now just out of that, let me scroll down. And as you can see, I have here input text boxes. Now let me specify here Formik on change event. If you back to the Formik documentation, then you can notice you have to add on change to the input text boxes with their name. And you also need to specify the value attribute. So right down here to this input text box, here I'm going to say on change is equal to, in the object you specify Formik, this Formik constant variable dot handle change. You don't need to create this method because Formik will automatically handle it whenever there is a change inside this input text box. So if you type anything inside this input text box, the handle change is automatically going to fire. Just out of that, you specify value here, and value is going to be Formik dot values dot email. As you know, inside these values you have all your input text boxes values. Let me do the same for the second input text box. So let me copy this, pass that right here, and instead of this values email, now I'm going to specify values dot password. You already have this password property to these values. This is because you initialize this password property at the top. You can see I'm going to specify that values to this input text boxes. Let me open the console, and if I type here daily@gmail.com, then I'm going to type my password, and when I click on this login button, it's not going to do anything because you can see to this form you don't have on submit handler function. So what you have to do is you have to pass this handler function, this on submit handler function, to this form. So to pass that, you specify here on submit, and right here you specify Formik dot handle submit. These all are the Formik method. You don't have to create this. You are accessing these methods using this Formik instance. Back to the project, reload it, and now if I specify here daily@gmail.com, then specify some password here. When I click on this login button, you can see I'm going to get a response inside my console. Later, I'm going to add validation to this input text boxes. Just for now, just back to the Formik, and when you scroll down, the handle submit is a submission handler. So whenever there is a change inside input, select, or text area text box, this handler function is going to execute, and the values is going to be the current values of the Formik form. When you scroll down, here you have all the information of this form. Using this function, you can remove all the boilerplate code of your Formik form. So you don't have to use on change, handle change, on blur, handle blur to your input text box. Just need to say Formik dot get field props. When you scroll down, you can see the use of this get field props. So let me just do the same for this login page. So instead of these properties, I'm simply going to pass here curly braces, and here I'm going to first pass spread operator, and then I'm going to say here Formik dot get field props, and inside this parentheses in the single quote I'm going to specify the name of this input text box, email. And let me do the same for this second text box right here. So let me get it up both this statement, and then specify here Formik get field props, and this is for password. Back to the project, and if I click on this login, this is still going to work fine. Now let's add Formik to the registration page. So click on sign up and open the register page, and here we have 4 input text boxes. Now what I want to get all the values of these input text boxes and print in the console. So I'm going to back to my project, and here I'm going to click on this register.js. Right up here we need to first import Formik. So I'm going to say here import use Formik from Formik, and then right down here I'm going to say constant Formik is equal to use Formik, and inside an object you specify different properties. So what you have to do is you have to first specify the initial values. So as you know, inside this registration form, you have different input text boxes. So we are going to create all that properties inside these initial values. So you know that we have username. So we specify here a property called username and specify initial value empty string. Then I'm going to specify here email, password, and C password means confirm password. So I'm going to have 4 text boxes in my form. So I'm going to create here 4 properties. And then I'm going to specify these property values to the input text boxes. Let me create here and specify the onSubmit function. So I'm going to say here on submit. As you know, I don't have this function. So let me create that right down here. I'm going to say async function on submit. And you get all the values as a parameter inside this function. And then I'm going to see here console.log values. Scroll down from these input text boxes, you need to get values. So right down here, you have to say curly braces, and then you need to call get field props. So just pass here spread operator first, then say Formik dot get field props. And inside this parenthesis, you specify the name of this field. This field is for username. So I'm going to say here username. Let me copy this. For the second text box right here, I'm going to specify the same statement, but this time instead of username, I'm going to say here email. Do the same for the third text box, and instead of this username, I'm going to say here password. And do the same for this last text box, and I'm going to specify here C password. And at the end, don't forget to specify onSubmit function to this form right here. So you specify here onSubmit, and inside this you specify Formik dot handle submit. Let me save the changes. Back to the project, open the console, reload the browser, and if I specify here username, email, some password, by clicking on this button you can see your password. And when I click on this login button, you can see I'm going to get all the values of this form. Let me change this login button name to register or sign up. That's upon you. So I'm just going to change the name of this button. When you click on this button, you're going to get all the values of your form as a response. Now adding Formik to this login page, it's super easy. Let's take a look at how you can validate these input text boxes using Formik. So if you click on tutorial, when you scroll down, you will have the validation section. Right here, you can see how you can validate the input of the user. What you have to do is you have to pass a property use Formik, which is validate, and this is a type of function. Now because the function name and the property name is same, that is why here we just have validate. And inside this function, you can access the values of your input text boxes. So let me just create this function right inside this use Formik hook. So I'm going to back to the login.js, and right up here you can see here I have the Formik hook, and inside this Formik hook you have to pass here a property called validate, this one, and then to this property you specify a function. So you pass here a colon and specify a function here, something like this. And then inside this function you can access the values of your input text boxes. So just pass here values. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this parameter. That's it. Using this function you can validate your input text boxes. But instead of adding this function right here, because we have multiple input text boxes, so instead of adding this function right here as an arrow function, I'm going to create a new file and specify all the validation inside that file. Inside this project right here, I'm going to create a new folder first, and then I'm going to specify name to it, lib, library. And here I'm going to create a file, validate.js. Now that's upon you. You can specify any name to this file. Inside this file, I'm going to export a default function, and the function name is login validate. And you get all the values of your input text boxes as a parameter. So you pass here values, and then you pass this login validate to this validate property right here, something like this. And now what you have to do is you have to first import this. So right up here I'm going to say import login validate from the lib validate. Just out of that, inside this validate right here, you have to create an object. You have to say here constant errors is equal to and pass an empty object here. Now this object indicates that you don't have any error inside your form. And then right down here, I'm going to say if we don't have values inside the input text boxes, then I'm going to return an error message. So I'm going to say here if we don't have values inside email, I'm going to access the email property of these values. And then here I'm going to say if I don't have email, then I'm going to say here errors dot email, and then I'm going to return here required message. So if you leave your email text box blank, then I'm going to return this error message. And then I'm going to check the email format. So if you back to the documentation, then you can notice here you have this code here for this email. I'm going to just copy all this code and then specify that right here. So I'm going to first check if we don't have email, then return required message to this error. Else if I'm going to say if the format of the error is not valid, then I'm going to return this message invalid email address. Let's do the same thing for the password. So right down here, I'm going to say validation for password. And here I'm going to say if I don't have values dot password, then I'm going to say here errors dot password. And I'm going to say here equal to sign and say here required. Just after that, I'm going to say here else if, and then here I'm going to check for the second condition. If the password is less than 8 character and greater than 20 character, then I'm going to return the error message. So inside this if statement, I'm going to say if the values dot password dot length, if it is less than 8 characters, or if values dot password dot length, if it is greater than 20 characters, then I'm going to return error message. So I'm going to say here errors dot password is equal to, and here I'm going to say must be greater than 8 and less than 20 characters long. Now just after that, I'm also going to say here else if the values dot password, it is include empty string, or you can say empty space, then I'm going to return an error message. So I'm going to say here dot includes, and then I'm going to pass here white space, something like this. So if you have any space in your password, I'm going to return this error message, and I'm going to return here errors dot password is equal to invalid password. And then at the end, you have to return this error. Save this, back to the login, save this file. And now if I type here email password, when I click on the login button, I'm not going to get anything. This is because I have an error inside this input text boxes. To see the error, you can just print here console.log Formik dot errors. Save this file, back to the project, and you can see you're going to get an error that the password must be greater than 8 and less than 20 character long. And now if you remove this @ sign from this email, you can see you're going to get another error, which is invalid email address. And you're also going to get the password error in the same object. So until you have empty object inside this error, this onSubmit won't execute, because Formik is not going to call this onSubmit until you have empty object inside this errors property. So instead of console.log, inside your form, right down here, just after this email, just after this span tag, right down here, you can simply call here curly braces and say Formik dot errors dot email. And then if you have error here, then print a span tag, otherwise return nothing. So inside this span tag, you can simply print Formik dot errors dot email. Let me copy this and do the same for the password. So just out of this span tag, right down here, I'm going to say Formik errors dot password, and I'm going to change this value as well. This became password. Let me save this, back to the project, reload it, and if I type something here, you can see when I type something here, I'm going to get an error message, invalid email address, and the password is also required. You can move these messages wherever you want. That's upon you. So I'm going to just grab these messages and print that just after this division tag. So if the email is not valid, you will get this invalid email address error. And if you want to specify some styling to it, you can specify here class name and then specify here text rows 500. This will specify color to this message. You can do the same for this password message. Now let me reload the page, and whenever I type something here, I'm going to get all the error messages. Since the validation function runs on each keystroke against the entire form's values, it's not a great user experience for them. Formik keeps track of which fields have been visited. It stores this information in the object called touch. That's also a mirror of the values. So what I want when I finish typing, if there is an error, I want to display that error. Otherwise, I don't want to return anything. So just out of this condition, here I'm going to say and formik.touch.email. And let me do the same thing for the password. So right down here, I'm going to say @ and formik touch password. Back to the project, reload it. And now if I type something, you can see I'm not going to get any error. Once I finish typing and move to the next text box, then I'm going to get this error message. You can see. So the Formik is going to validate your input text boxes when you move to the other object. Now once you understand how you can add validation to the login page, let's take a look at how you can add validation to this register page. So I'm going to back to my project and open the register.js file. As you can see, this is my use Formik hook. So I have to add here a validate property. So I'm just going to first create a function inside this validate.js. So right down here, I'm going to say export function register validate. And then you get all the values of your input text boxes as a parameter. So you get that inside this parenthesis. Just out of that, I'm going to say here constant errors is equal to and pass an object here. So back to the register.js. At the top, here I'm going to say import. In the object, I'm going to pass register validate from in the single quote, specify // lib and then validate.js file. Now because we don't have default to this export, I'm going to wrap this inside this object. Let me just copy this register validate and then right here I'm going to say validate colon and then pass this function name register validate. Don't forget to pass here comma because we have next property here. Back to the validate.js and right down here I'm going to say if I don't have values dot username. If I don't have the username, then I'm going to say here errors dot username is equal to required, and then I'm going to call here else if values dot username dot includes. If the username includes any space, then I'm going to return error message errors dot username is equal to invalid username. So let me copy this first validation of this login validate right down here, and I also have password inside my login. So let me copy this password validation from this login validate. Let me copy this and specify that here. Just out of that, inside my form, I also have here confirm password. So I have to add here if statement for the confirm password. So I'm going to say here validate confirm password, and here I'm going to say if I don't have values dot c password, then I'm going to return this error message. But this time instead of password, I'm going to return this with c password. Then I'm going to say else if the values dot password is not equal to values dot c password, then I'm going to return error message, and I will return here error dot c password is equal to password not match. Just out of that, I'm also going to say here else if values dot c password dot includes. If the c password includes any space, then I'm going to return an error message and say here errors dot c password is equal to invalid confirm password. Now this else condition won't execute because we already validated the password. If you want, you can remove this last else if condition. Just out of that, at the end you have to return error. So I'm going to say here errors. Now your validation of the registration form is ready. Let me save this file. Back to the register.js. Right down here, just after this division tag, I'm going to pass curly braces and I'm going to copy this statement and then specify that right here. Now this time instead of formik errors dot password, I'm going to say username. Do the same for this second condition and do the same for this value. Let me copy this, scroll down and specify that here. And this is for the email. So you specify here email. Copy this, specify that here and here. Just out of that, let me copy this statement, specify that to the password. So just out of this div right here, I'm going to say password. Copy this field, change this email to password, and this became password. Scroll down, copy this statement and write down here at the end, just out of this confirm input element, I'm going to say here C password. Copy this, specify that here and then specify that here. Save the changes back to the registration form, reload it, and now if I type something here inside this input text box, I'm not going to get any error because this is a valid username. But if I specify here space, you can see I'm going to get here error message, invalid username. This is because we have space here. Now just out of that, you can see we also have here email error, which is required. If I forget to add email, I'm going to get this error message, required. If I type the email, you can see the error message is gone because we have a valid email. After that, let me type here password. Move to the confirm password. I'm not going to get any error. This is because we have a valid password here. If I remove this 4, this 3 right from here, I'm going to get an error message. Must be greater than 8 and less than 20 character long. So I'm going to get this error because we have password less than 8 character. And if I increase the character length, when I type here 13, I'm going to get the same message again. This is because now the password have more than 20 characters. So let me just remove this. You can see this is a valid password. Now let me specify the same password right down here. If I say here admin, I'm going to get here error message, password not match. Oops, I think misspelled here password. Let me specify here 1, 2, 3 and 4. You can see now my password is matching, so I'm not going to get any error here. If I type here 5, I'm going to get error message, password not match. Let me remove this 5 from here. And now if I click on this sign up button and open the console, I'm going to get an object and I'm going to have all the values of this input text boxes as a response. Now that's upon you. You can add more validation inside this form or add sanitization. So that's completely upon you. Now once you understand how you can validate these input text boxes, let's take a look at how you can create a MongoDB database and connect that with your Next.js project. But before we connect the MongoDB database to this application, let me tweak this application a little bit. So instead of these error messages, I'm going to specify red border to these text boxes whenever there is an error inside this input. So instead of this Formik, I'm going to add border color when there is an error inside this input text box. So to this div, I'm going to specify this condition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this style input group. Here I'm going to pass template string and then I'm going to pass dollar and curly braces. Inside this, I'm going to print the default styling and then I'm going to say here dollar curly braces, and here I'm going to call this condition, which is Formik error password and Formik touch password. Copy this and specify that here. So if we have true inside this condition, then I'm going to return border rows 600. And if this condition return false, then I'm going to return nothing. Now let me just comment this statement. If you want, you can use this statement in your application. That's upon you. Let me save these changes. And now you can see I don't have error message to this password. Instead, I'm just going to get this red border to this input text box. Let me do the same for this email. Let me comment this, copy this condition. At the top, here I'm going to specify template string, something like this. Call here dollar curly braces and call dollar curly braces again. And here I'm going to specify that condition, copy this input style group and then specify that right here. And just out of that, after this condition, here I'm going to say if this condition is true, then return border rows 600. Otherwise, return nothing. Save this file, back to the project, reload it. And now if I have error inside this input text boxes, I'm going to get this red border instead of the text messages. Now just out of that, let me create MongoDB database and connect that with this application. So I'm going to back to cloud.mongodb.com and create a new project. You can see I already have here a project called Auth. If you want to create a new project, you can click on this new project button and create your new project. I already have one, so I'm going to select this Auth project. Inside this, I don't have any database. So let's create a new database here. So to create a database, you have to click on this build a database button. When you click on this button, you'll have these options. Choose the free option and create a share cloud database. Just after that, I'm going to leave everything as it is. Scroll down and change this cluster name. This became Auth cluster. And I'm going to click on this create cluster button. Now once you've done that, I'm going to leave everything as it is and click on this finish and close. It will take about 3 to 4 minutes to create your cloud database. So let me click on database access, and here I already have a new user. If you want to create a new user, you can click on this add new database user. This is going to create a new user for your database. Just after that, I'm going to click on this network access and include my current IP address by clicking on this add IP address button. When I click on this button from this window, you can add your current IP address so you can access your database. Now once the Auth cluster is successfully created, you can connect this with your Next.js application. So to connect this, you can click on this connect button, and from here you can connect your application with the Next.js. So let me copy this link, close this, back to the project, open the terminal, stop the development server, clear the screen, and here I'm going to say npm install -d Mongoose. I'm going to install Mongoose module inside this project. So using this Mongoose, we can connect the MongoDB database. So let me just start the development server again, and I'm going to create a new file inside this project. And now let me create a new folder here for the connection. So let me create a folder with the name database, and inside this, I'm going to have a file called con.js. Inside this file, we need to first import Mongoose from Mongoose. Then you need to say here constant connect mongo is equal to async function. I'm going to return the async function here, something like this. And then I'm going to call here try and catch block. Inside the catch block, I'm simply going to return promise.reject, which is going to be the error value. And inside this try block, I'm going to say constant. In the object, I'm going to say connection is equal to await, and then call mongoose.connect. And inside this mongoose.connect, I'm going to specify my MongoDB URL. So I'm going to first open the .env.local file, and right here, I'm going to create mongo URL is equal to, and then I'm going to paste my URL here. And then what I want, just out of this Mongo URL, let me get rid of this password. And here I'm going to say here admin123. And then I'm going to save these changes. Back to the connection, and inside this connect right here, I'm going to say process.env.mongoURL like this. So this is going to create a new connection. Just out of that, once we have the connection, I can say here if connection dot ready state, if it is equal to 1, then return promise dot resolve, and this is going to be the true value. Ready state property is going to return 3 values: 0 for disconnected, 1 for connected, 2 for connecting, and 3 for disconnecting. So if we have successful connection, this ready state property is going to return 1, and when this condition return true, I'm going to return promise with resolve true. And at the end, right down here, I need to say export default connect mongo, this function. Just for that, once you have the successful connection, you can create a schema for the user. So the user can specify their username, email, and password. So just click on the sign up, and for this registration, we are going to create a new schema and create a new endpoint for the registration. Now, once we create the successful MongoDB connection, let's create the MongoDB schema and specify array border to all these text boxes, because I don't want these error messages. So I'm going to back to the register.js file. Let me close all these files. Inside this register.js, to the first input text box, right up here, I'm going to copy this condition, and then right here, I'm going to select this, specify template string like this, and then call here $, curly braces, and paste that condition. Then I'm going to say here question mark. If this condition became true, then return border rows 600. Otherwise, return nothing. And then you need to copy this and then specify that inside the curly braces, because this is also a variable. Now let me remove this message. You can see I don't have this message. Let me do the same for this second input text box. Let me copy this division tag completely and then specify that right here. And instead of this condition, this time I'm going to copy this condition and then specify that right here. And then I'm going to comment this statement. So I'm going to have the red border to the email. Then let me do the same thing for this div. Let me copy this div and specify that right here. After that, let me copy this condition, comment this statement, and then specify this condition here. Just after that, let me copy this div at the last time and then specify that here. Then let me copy this condition and then specify this condition right up here. Comment this statement, save the changes. You can see now I'm going to have this red border to all the input text boxes. So if there is an error inside this input text boxes, I'm going to get this red border. Now that's upon you. You can display user messages as well. That's completely upon you. Now once you done that, let me create the user schema. So to create a MongoDB schema, I'm going to create a new folder inside this project. Name this folder model, and then here I'm going to create a new file. Name this file schema.js. And inside this file, let me first import few statements. Now because we need schema object from the Mongoose, we need models and model from the Mongoose. At the top, we need to say import. In the object, we say schema from Mongoose. And then we also need model and models. Just out of that, right down here, we need to say constant user schema is equal to new schema. And inside this object, I'm going to say username is going to be the string. We specify type of data inside this field. Then email is also going to be string. And the password is also a type of string. Now we don't need to create this confirm password field. Just out of that, right down here, we need to say constant users is equal to model, and I'm going to create a new model with the name user. And then we specify schema to it, means structure of the document. So I'm going to say here user schema. So this is going to create a new model inside a MongoDB and specify this structure. In Next.js, you also need to specify these models. What if you already have this model inside your database? In that case, you need to use that existing model. So in Next.js, you need to specify here models dot user, and then specify your model statement. So if you already have existing model, then use this statement. Otherwise, use this a second statement. Just out of that, you need to export this. So export as default users. Save this file, close this schema, and then I'm going to create a new endpoint inside this API, inside this auth folder. Right here, I'm going to create a new endpoint. The endpoint name is sign up. So when you click on this sign up button, I'm going to call that endpoint. So inside this auth here, I'm going to create a new file with the name signup.js. Now that's upon you. You can specify any name to this endpoint. Inside this endpoint here, we need to export a default function. So this is going to be the async function. So we need to first pass here async function and name this function handler. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this function. Here we need to call two parameters, request and response. Inside this, just for now, I'm going to say response.json, and inside this I'm going to say message sign up post request. Now to check this endpoint is working or not, you have to head on to the API folder. Inside that you have auth folder, and inside that you have your signup.js. So I'm going to pass here sign up. When I press enter, you can see I'm going to have your message sign up post request. Now as you know, this is not a post request, this is the get request. What I only want to execute this handler when there is a post request. So only for the post request, I'm going to execute this handler. Otherwise, I'm not going to return anything. For that, we need to check the HTTP method. And using this endpoint, I'm going to store all these register values inside this MongoDB database. So let me show you how to do it. Now, once you understand how you can make this sign up endpoint, let's take a look at how you can store the user input value inside your MongoDB database. So what we have to do is we need to first connect MongoDB database and then get the user input from these input text boxes. And then I'm going to store that input text boxes values inside my MongoDB database. So instead of this response, I'm going to first call the connect mongo function. So I'm going to say here import connect mongo from, specify here a double dot forward slash, then again specify double dot forward slash, and then again specify double dot forward slash. Then I'm going to select the database folder and then connection.js file. And inside this file, as you know, we have connect.mongo. So let me copy this function, specify that here, and this is going to call the connect mongo function from this file. Just out of that, we need to catch here errors. So I'm going to see here catch error, and then if we have error, then I'm going to just return that error using response.json, and inside this JSON, I'm going to return that error. So in the double quote, I'm going to say connection failed. If there is no error, then I'm going to say here only post method is accepted. I'm going to accept only post method using this sign up endpoint. So to check the post method, we need to say here if request.method, if it is equal to post. If it is a type of post request, then execute this if statement, otherwise return the else statement. So inside this else, I'm simply going to say response.status, which is going to be 500, which is the error status, and then I'm going to say here .json, and inside the JSON, I'm returning the message, which is going to be HTTP method not valid, only post accepted. Just out of that, inside this if statement right here, we need to say if we don't have the user input. From this form, when the user click on this sign up button, we're going to get all the values of this input text boxes. So here we need to check if we don't have the user input. So we need to say here if the request.body. So we pass here exclamation mark like this, and then I'm going to say here if we don't have the user input, then return response.status 404, which is the error status .json, and I'm going to return error, and the error is going to be don't have form data. If you don't have form data, then you're going to get this error message, and if you have form data, then you can get this data in the request.body variable. I'm going to destructure all the values of the form data inside an object. So I'm going to see here constant. In the object, I'm going to destructure all the values. As you know, we have username, email, and password. You're going to get this object from this form when you click on the sign up button. Now, just out of that, when we have values inside these variables, right down here, we need to check the duplicate users. So if we have two users with the same name, then I'm going to return an error message because the user is already registered in this application. So we don't need to register the user again. So in that case, I'm going to say here constant check existing is equal to, and then I'm going to call here await. Now, because this is the async function, we can call here await users. I don't have users, so let me remove it. And at the top right here, I'm going to say import users from, in the single quote, I'm going to say double dot forward slash, and then I'm going to specify here model. And from the model, I can access the schema file. So inside the schema, I have this user object. So I can access that inside this statement. I'm going to say here users, this variable dot find one, and I'm going to find the user with the email. So if there is a matching email inside my database of the user, that is the existing user. So for that, I'm simply going to say if we have value inside this check existing, then I'm going to return response.status, which is going to be 422, and then I'm going to return JSON with message. The message is going to be user already exists. And just out of that, we don't have anything inside this variable. So if this condition return false, then I'm going to store all the values of the input text boxes in the database. Now, as you know, you can't store the password value as it is. You need to hash that value for the security reason. For that, you need to hash this password. So I'm going to open my terminal, and I'm going to say here npm install bcrypt.js. This is going to install this library in my project. So right down here, I'm simply going to say here users dot create. I'm going to create a new data inside MongoDB database. So I'm going to call here a method create. Inside this method, you need to first pass the data. So in the object, we pass username, this variable. Then I'm going to pass email, and then I'm going to pass password. But as I said, we don't need to store the password as it is. Instead, we need to convert this password and hash it. So we pass here colon and pass here await, and here I'm going to call a function hash. Now let me just get this function from the bcrypt library. So I'm going to say here import. In the object, you have to say hash from, in the single quote, you specify bcrypt.js. And right down here, I'm going to specify here hash, and here we specify the password and the salt value. Now this bcrypt hashing function allows us to build a password security, and it always hashes every password with the salt. So we are going to hash the password before we store it in the database. Now once you've done that, once you hash your password, just pass your comma and create a function here. This function is going to return error if there is an error when storing the data in the MongoDB database, and it also going to return data variable. Inside this data variable, we are going to have all the data of the response. So right down here, I'm going to say if error, if we have error, then return response.status, which is going to be 404.json. And inside this JSON, I'm simply going to return this error, this one. I'm going to get this error from this parameter. Just so that if I don't have any error, then I'm going to return the response.status, which is 201. And then I'm going to call here .json. In the object, I'm going to return status, true, and user is going to be data, this one, this variable. So inside this variable, I'm going to have the response from the MongoDB database. That's it. Your registration endpoint is now completely ready. Let me save these changes. Let me test this post request. Now to test this endpoint, I'm going to open the Postman API testing tool. And here I'm going to open the endpoint called signup. So I'm going to head on to the localhost 3000 API auth, and then we have the endpoint name signup. And the type of HTTP request is post. So I'm going to select here post. Just after that, we need to pass body as well with this request. So if I select here none and make a request, then I'm going to get error message, don't have form data. This is because we didn't return anything with this signup. Now what we have to do is we have to return data with this signup. So the signup endpoint is going to store all that values in the MongoDB database. So let me click on this raw and select the JSON format. Inside this, I'm going to create an object with username, email, and password. Right now you can see the password, but when I store the password will completely hashed. So when I click on the send button, you can see it's going to store all this value in the MongoDB database, and I'm going to have my response what I want. I'm going to have status true, and I'm going to get this user. MongoDB is uniquely create ID for all the documents, and you can notice here we have hash password here. Now once we have this data in the MongoDB database, now we can log in with this data with email and password. So let's take a look at how to do it. Now once you have all your data inside the MongoDB database, using this data we can log in using this login form. We just need to specify the email and the password. Once you specify that, you can click on the login button and log in inside your website. So you can then successfully authorize for the application. So to make the login page, I'm going to back to the login. Right inside these pages, I'm going to open the login.js, close this sign up and this register. As you know, when you click on the on submit, it's going to console.log the email and the password value. What I want, when I click on this on submit button with values, I want to call this sign up method. And as you know, using this method, you can authorize the user. Right now, this method is used for Google and for GitHub. Let's do the same thing for our own credential. So let's create a credential provider inside this NextAuth file. So at the top, you need to first import credential provider from NextAuth provider. Or you can just grab this credential provider and import that as a default import. So you have to specify here / and then specify here credential. Both statements are identical. Once you have your credential provider, you can then specify this credential provider to this provider property. So just out of this GitHub provider, right down here, I'm going to specify this credential provider. And inside this parenthesis, I'm going to specify different options inside this object. So what we have to do is we need to specify here name, the name of the credential provider, which is credentials. Then we call here a function. So let me just call here first async function. So I'm going to say here async authorize function. Now this is the callback function, and this function is going to execute once the user is to be authorized. So when the user successfully authorized, this function is going to store the user token inside the cookies. Now to this function, you have two parameters. First is credentials, and second is request. Using these credentials, you can access your username and password. Just for that, let me first check the MongoDB connection. So at the top, I'm going to import the connect Mongo from database from the connection file. And right down here, I'm going to check if we have the valid connection, then move on, or otherwise return error message. So I'm going to say here error, and here I'm going to call error connection failed, something like this. So if there is an error, I'm going to return this message. Now just for that, when the user specify their email and click on the login button, we need to find that user first and then check their password. So I'm going to say here check user existence. So I'm simply going to say here constant result is equal to await, and then I'm going to call here users. Now as you know, we don't have these users inside this file. So at the top, I'm going to say import users // and then I'm going to specify the model folder, and inside that we have this schema, and from the schema I'm going to grab these users and specify that here, and then I'm going to say here dot find one, and as you know, to check the user we are using email. So inside this object I'm going to specify email, specify here colon, and then I'm going to specify this credential object. Now when you specify your username and password to the signup method, it's going to pass all your values to this credential, and then you can access your username and password right inside this credential object. So right down here, I'm going to say credential dot email, something like this. Now this statement is going to find the user and then specify that to this result variable. So this means that the user is successfully registered. Now once the user is successfully registered, you have to check their password. Right down here, I'm going to say if the user is not registered, then I'm going to call here this error message. So I'm going to call here exclamation mark and say here result. So if this statement won't return anything, we don't have that user inside the database. In that case, I'm going to throw a new error, and the error is no user found with the email. Please sign up. That's it. Now just for that, once we have the user, we need to check their password. We have the password in the hash format, so we need to just compare that password with your credential password. So instead of converting that password into a readable format, the base script is going to provide us a function called compare. The compare function is just going to compare both the passwords and return true and false value. This is just what we need. So at the top, right up here, I'm going to say import. In the object, I'm going to call here compare from basescript.js. Just out of that, right down here, just out of this comment, here I'm going to say constant check password is equal to await, and then call this function compare. And then inside this function, you need to specify both your password. The password you specify with the signup function and the password you have in the database. So inside this parenthesis, I'm going to first specify the signup password. So I'm going to call here credential dot password, and as a second argument we specify result dot password. Now the result dot password is going to return the database password, and this credential dot password is going to return the signup password. So when we call the signup, we're going to pass the password as well with the signup method. Just out of that, if this return true, then I'm going to return the result, otherwise I'm not going to return any result. So here I'm going to check the incorrect password. So we need to say here if check password. So if the check password return false, or result dot email, if it is not equal to credential dot email, then execute this if block, and from this if block I'm going to throw a new error. So I'm going to say here throw error in the object, in the double quote, I'm going to say username or password doesn't match, and if everything is well, then I'm going to return this result. So I'm going to say here return result, this variable. That's it. Now the authorization is successfully created. Now what you have to do is you have to call sign up inside your login. So back to the login.js, and instead of this console.log, here you're going to say await sign in, this function, and then you specify the name, which is credentials, and then I'm going to specify here comma and pass some properties. So we need to first say here redirect which is going to be false. And then I'm going to specify my email. As you know, inside these values, we have the email. So I'm going to say here values dot email. Then I'm going to specify the password. And we have this password inside values dot password right here. And at the end, we need to specify the callback URL. So I'm going to redirect the user to the home page, something like this. Just out of that, this function is going to return the status of the transaction. So what we are going to do is we're going to get that transaction inside a variable. I'm going to say here constant status is equal to, and then right down here, I'm going to say console.log and print that status. Let me save this file. At the top, let me copy my username and password. So let me copy this email and this password. Now let me copy this back to the project, reload it, click on the inspect and open the console. Now let me specify the email and this password. When I click on the login button, I'm going to get this console message. Inside this console, I'm not going to get any error. OK is going to be true. The status is 200. And then we get this callback URL, which is the home page. So now using this callback URL, we can redirect the user to the home page. So let me just do that. So using the status, instead of this console.log, here I can say if the status dot OK, if it is returned true, then I'm going to redirect the user to the home page. To redirect the user, I'm using the use route. So right down here, I'm going to say import use router from next router. Let me just remove this unwanted import statement right from here. Just out of that, let me copy this use router. And after this, here I'm going to say constant router is equal to use router. I'm going to initialize this variable. Just out of that, I'm going to copy this variable router. And if this return true, then I'm going to say here router dot push, and I'm going to push this application to the status dot URL. So I'm going to pass here status dot URL, something like this. Back to the project, reload it, and now let me specify my email and my password. Now when I click on the login button, you can see now I'm going to redirect to the authorize page, and here I have my email. And now if I click on this sign out button, it's going to sign out from this application. It's going to remove all the tokens from the cookies. So this is how you can simply create the credential in this application. Now at the last, when we click on this sign up button, we need to store all the values of these input text boxes in the database. So as you know, inside the pages, inside this register.js, we have this empty on submit function. Previously, we added all the values in the MongoDB using Postman API testing tool. We successfully test the API using Postman. Now what I want, when I click on this on submit, I want to store all these values in the MongoDB database. But let me first show you the result of this console.log. Back to the project and open the console. And if I type here the username, then the email, then the password, and when I click on the sign up button, you're going to get an object. Inside this object, you will have all the data of your form. Now what I want to pass this data to the backend. So to pass this data to the backend, what we need to do is we need to call fetch function of JavaScript. So here inside this on submit, when we validate all the input text boxes, this on submit is going to execute, and then we create a constant option variable. And then inside this variable, we specify options to the fetch method. So we first specify here method, which is type of post. Then we need to specify here headers. Headers is going to be content type application JSON. Just out of that, we need to specify body. Body is going to be JSON dot stringify, and we need to pass here data. So I'm going to pass this values here, this one, the form data values. And just out of that, right down here, I'm going to say fetch, or you can call here await fetch. And then inside this fetch, you need to specify your URL. You have your sign up inside this API and inside this auth folder right here. I'm going to open the Postman API testing tool, and here is the URL of this endpoint. Localhost 3000 API auth sign up. I'm going to specify this URL here like this. And just out of that, we need to specify all these options as a second parameter. I'm going to specify here comma and say here options. Just out of that, if you want to get the response in JSON format, then you can call here then response, and then you can say here response.json. So this is going to return the response in JSON format, and then you can get this response using then method. So you just need to say here data and console.log. So in the console.log, when you make a request, you will get your data. But I'm not going to console.log this data. Instead, I'm going to redirect the user to the login page. So what I have to do is I have to call use router at the top. So I'm going to say here import. In the object, we need to say use router from next router. So I'm going to call this statement use router from next router. Just after that, you need to call this hook inside your component. So right down here, I'm going to say constant router is equal to use router. And just after that, right down here inside this, then here I'm going to call this statement, this one. Copy this and specify that here. But as you know, you don't have this status, so you can use your data. If you have data inside this variable, then execute this statement. And then what you have to do is inside this push right here, you have to call this localhost 3000, something like this. And now if you register a new user and click on the sign up, it's going to redirect you to the login page. And then using this login page, you can log in with the user credential. Now I'm going to leave everything as it is, and I'm going to back to the console. Here you can notice I'm getting this console warning, which is no secret. The NextAuth used to generate a secret for convenience when the user did not define one. In that case, you get this warning. To solve this warning, you need to specify secret property to the NextAuth. So inside the NextAuth, just after this provider, right down here, you can specify secret. And here you need to specify the random base 64 value. So you have to open your terminal, stop the development server, clear the screen, and type a command called open SSL random hyphen base 64. The random 64 bit is going to generate a value. Copy it and then specify that right here to the secret. Save this file. And now if you say npm run dev, you can see you're not going to get any warning inside your console. Now just out of that, let me show you how you can protect the route inside Next.js. Now let's suppose that you also have the profile route inside your pages. So for example, let's suppose that if I create here a component with the name profile.js, and let me say here export default function, and here I'm going to return an object, and then here I'm going to say section and specify some Tailwind classes here. So the classes is going to be container mx auto text center. Just out of that, here I'm going to add h3 heading tag and then specify some Tailwind classes here as well. So I'm going to specify here class names is going to be text for Excel and font bold. And then I'm going to specify here text profile page. Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to call the link component and then specify here link to the home page. And then in the href attribute, we need to specify here address of the home page. At the top, don't forget to import link from next link. Now let me save this file and show you the result first. Back to the project, and now if I try to access this profile, let's suppose if I remove this login and specify here profile, then you can see I can easily access this profile page without the need of authentication. I want to protect this page from unauthorized user. In that case, right down here, I'm going to say export async function. Then the function name is get server side props. And then you specify here an object and say here request. And right down here, you have to say constant session is equal to await, and then call here get session. And you get this get session from the NextAuth React library. So at the top, you have to say import in the object get session from NextAuth React. So from this library, you get this get session function. And then inside this function, you just need to specify an object and pass this request, this one. This is going to return the session to this variable. And now you can say here if you don't have session, then return an object. And inside this object, you can redirect the user. So pass here property redirect and then specify here destination. The destination is going to be the login page. So I'm going to pass here login. And just after that, I'm going to specify here comma and say here permanent false. Just after that, at the end, right down here, I'm going to return the props with session. So if we have the authorized user, I'm going to return this statement. So let me just specify here, authorize user return session. So I'm going to return this session when there is an authorized user. Otherwise, I'm going to redirect the user to the login page. Let me save the changes. Oops, I think I misspelled here. Destination. When I'm back to the project, you can see if I try to access the profile page, I'm going to redirect to the login page. Now, if I want to access the profile page, I have to log in first. So let me specify my email right here and the password like this. When I click on the login button, I'm going to redirect to the login page. And now if I try to access the profile page, let's suppose if I click on this profile page, you can see I can now access the profile page. Now if I back to the home page, I can click on this link, and if I click on this sign out and try to access the profile page again, this is going to redirect me to the login page because now I'm not the authorized user. So this is how you can protect all your routes of your application. So I hope you understand many new things from this project. If you find anything useful, make sure to press the like button, share this video with your friends, subscribe for more latest videos. And yes, if you want to download this project, you have to head on to the 17 final branch. You have to first clone this project using git clone and the project URL. I will put the link in the description. Just out that, once you clone the project, you have to enter into this final branch. You have to specify git switch 17 and press tab. This is going to auto complete this branch and press enter. Once you press enter, you are in the last branch of this project. And now from here, you can get all the source code of this project. To run this project, don't forget to execute npm install command and then specify npm run dev. Like this video if you find anything useful, subscribe for more latest videos. That is all for now. I will see you in the next one.